Okay, as people keep trickling in, I'll just start the webinar now and welcome everybody to Protein Industries Canada's IP 2.0 webinar in conjunction with MLT Aikins. Before we begin, I would like to take you through a couple of the features of Zoom webinar so you're familiar with how to operate the features during this presentations. The first is the audio settings. You should be able to find this in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. If you're on a mobile or tablet, this could be in the upper right-hand portion of your screen. You can use this to figure out any issues you may be having with audio. The second is the chat function. We will primarily use the chat function for technical issues. If you have any issues and need support, you can direct your questions to me via the chat, and I will respond throughout the webinar today. The third feature is the Q&A feature. We will use this Q&A feature to moderate questions at the end of the presentations. So throughout the presentations, we will not answer questions. We will hold them to the end and do a moderated session. Please pose your Q&As in the Q&A section. There's also a upvoting feature within the Q&A. So if you also would like to answer a question that somebody else has already asked, if you use the thumbs up button, it will push this question to the top of the list and help us curate the most widely asked questions. And lastly, we are recording today's session to be able to post and share for the future. So with that said, I'd like to pass it over to Megan Gervais to introduce our speaker and topic today.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Carson. My name is Megan Gervais, and I am the Intellectual Property Manager for Protein Industries Canada. So I'll be doing a piece of the presentation today, but really for the bulk of it, I'm going to pass it over to Crystal Allen. So Crystal joins us today from MLT Aikins, where she is a partner. Crystal's primary focus in her practice is around advising clients on the development, management, and commercialization of intellectual property assets and new technologies. Crystal also advises extensively regarding risk management, privacy and policy development related to data sharing and electronic documents. So we're very lucky to have Crystal joining us today, and I'm looking forward to hearing her discussion on extracting value from your intellectual property. So I'll pass it over to Crystal. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that very kind introduction, Megan. I'm going to share my screen, and then we will dive into a slide deck that sort of takes us through this topic. Bear with me for one moment while I do that. Okay, and I'll just wait for a thumbs up from Carson. Okay, perfect. So everybody can see that. That's great. Yeah, so thank you for being here today, everyone. This is, as you may be aware, the second in a two-part webinar series that PIC is offering to the broader sort of ag and food industry. Part one was our IP 1.0 or IP 101 discussion. In that particular webinar, what we focused on was really an overview of what the key types of intellectual property are, how to secure that intellectual property or protect it, and some common mistakes that I as a practitioner have seen and that are relatively pervasive when dealing with intellectual property. So that was really our introductory session to kind of get your feet wet with IP. In this session, we're going to do a bit of a deeper dive and kind of take things to a little bit of a more complex place when we're talking about IP. So our focus, as Megan mentioned, is on a discussion of how to extract value from IP. And with that in mind, we kind of have two primary objectives in our discussion today. The first is that one of our goals is to enhance your understanding of how to approach that extraction of value from proprietary technology. The second objective is to enhance your understanding of how to apply proprietary technology or intellectual property, and I'll use the terms intellectual property or IP and technology quite interchangeably through this session, in the agri-food value chain. and within collaborative projects. So we're going to try and go through some principles and use some examples and some context for you to help you think about how to do this and what might make sense within your organization in this industry space. So I do want to say, though, before we start to get into that deeper dive, it's important to remember that there really isn't a one-size-fits-all approach to doing this, to handling IP or extracting value from it. It is very context-driven and very dependent upon what your IP is, what type of organization you are, and what your goals are. So it's important to remember that proprietary technology or IP is a business tool, and you should treat it as such. So we're going to walk through some strategies today about how to do that, some common commercial arrangements that are used to do that, and hopefully give you a good slice of information about this topic that you can take away. So let's dive in. I don't know about you, but I always like a visual. So I thought I would throw one in right at the outset here. Really, when we're talking about extracting value from technology, the question we're really asking is, how do I achieve a return on my research and development or R&D investment? The answer to that, as I alluded to earlier, is really, really context-driven and individual. So there are a number of considerations that one can take into account when trying to answer that question, but the answer to that question for each organization or each individual inventor is going to be a bit different. So in trying to answer that question, though, it's important to recognize that over time, what your goal is and what your strategy should be to achieve that goal can change. There is something that is kind of known more widely as a product adoption life cycle. And this sort of illustrates for you in the graph kind of what that is and what that means. So we kind of have three phases that occur within that product adoption life cycle. And your strategy regarding IP and that product will change throughout the course of that cycle. So in the development phase of that cycle, the focus is really on kind of creating IP or acquiring IP and technology assets. So you're building there, you're developing something. In the growth phase that you move into next, you know that you have something and you know that it's of value and you want to extract value from it. So you might start to think about things like protecting that IP, figuring out your market for that IP, and approaching protection with that sort of market and those goals in mind. After the growth phase, you move into something called a maturing phase, which is where your focus shifts away from just looking at IP broadly. And instead, by that point, you have a better idea of what IP has been most valuable and successful for you. So you start to focus on those key assets and look at what to do with your less material or less key assets. That may involve kind of redeploying them to other applications or functions. It may involve divesting those other technologies, but there you're maturing, you're trimming your portfolio of IP and focusing your efforts going forward on what is most likely to create the greatest return for you. So taking into account where you are in that life cycle, and as I said, that's going to vary over time, there are a number of questions that you can kind of ask yourself or you can ask within your organization to help you answer the question of what should my strategy be to get a return on my investment that I put into this technology or this IP that I'm thinking of. So I'll give you an example of some of those questions that can be asked and sort of what we're alluding to with those. So a key question to ask here is, how is my technology best used? This is really, the answer to this question is driven both by potential product applications. So what types of products do you think that technology could be best used or best employed in? And also industry applications. So are there needs within your industry or industry segment that you are seeing? And if so, can your technology fit to help meet that need? Another question that is important to ask here is my technology best used on its own or in combination with other technology? In other words, does it need to be combined with something else to make it truly useful? Or is it suited as sort of a standalone type product or tech? And that's a question that the answer may even change to over time. You might originally think this is best used on its own, and then discover through some of the arrangements we'll talk about a little bit later that maybe it's actually better if I do combine this with something, and the value that I achieve can be greater. Another question to ask is, what value does my technology have to third parties? Is it in demand? Are there others that are marketing something similar? Is the field crowded, so to speak? What makes your technology unique? So trying to figure out how it differs from what's already in the marketplace and how in demand it may be with third parties can help you decide what your approach should be to extracting value from that technology. Kind of building on that, you can ask the question about what is your market? Who will use it? Who will find it useful? Where will they use it? Are you catering to the current needs of your target customer, or are you trying to anticipate what future needs will be? So really put another way, are you seeing a demand or a need today, and your product is the way to kind of get in front of that and meet that demand and need right now? Or are you seeing something on the horizon, maybe in the short term to the midterm, that you think is going to be an issue that needs addressing, and you think you have a technology that can help do that? Whatever the answer is to that will also help you decide what your approach is to extracting value. A key question that sometimes isn't thought about that I think is really important to think about when you're having this initial sort of strategy thought is, do you actually have the tools in-house in your organization to help your technology reach the market that you think it needs to reach? Or do you need to partner with someone else who has that sort of, those tools and those resources to help make that happen? Not every organization that is really good at research is also really good at commercialization, and that's okay. We all serve different roles, and that's why collaboration can be very valuable, and we'll talk more about that later. So whatever your answers are to questions of that nature, the resulting strategy should be centered around helping you establish an advantageous business position. So for some organizations, that will mean being first to market above all else. And so you may be a little bit less focused on the growth phase of the life cycle and more on the development phase. So just get that product to market quickly. Don't worry so much about acquiring traditional forms of IP protection for it. This is often the case in things like simple consumer goods, where you have an average lifespan of about 18 months to kind of get that product to market and maximize sort of sales and uptake. For other organizations, this will mean having a longer term sustainable strategy that may be focused more on that growth phase that I talked about. So this is often the case where the technology that we're talking about has required a significant amount of time and capital to get it to market. And so the organization has a need to keep competitors at bay for a little bit longer so that it can recoup costs of developing that tech and recoup that cost more effectively and quickly. So next slide. Oops, a little too far. So asking those types of questions and thinking about that product adoption life cycle can really help you think through and start to define your strategy for what you want to do with your IP or technology and how you may want to approach extracting some value from it. Now, commercial arrangements are used to help you execute that strategy. So if you've defined what you want to achieve, you can leverage different types of commercial arrangements to help you achieve that. So there are many different types of commercial arrangements that can be used to facilitate your strategy. Going through all of them in detail would probably take us at least an entire day. So what I'm going to do today to help keep this a little bit more focused for you is to go through some of those really kind of common key types of commercial arrangements that you see a lot when you're dealing with IP. I'm going to introduce them, and then we're going to talk about them in a bit more detail, including some key considerations and key things that you should be thinking of and aware of when you're looking at these different types of commercial arrangements. So the first one that we'll talk about are sort of licensing arrangements. So these are very common. Probably nearly, if not all, everyone who's participating today is familiar with what a licensing arrangement is. They can be kind of a standalone like license agreement, or they can form part of a larger, broader arrangement. But however they are formed and whatever format they take, they're really focused on permitting use of a technology in order to allow it to get to market. These arrangements can be out-licensing arrangements where you are the technology owner and you are licensing it out to someone else to manufacture it, distribute it, or sell it into a market. They can be in-licensing models where you are someone who wants to meet, say, a market need or demand, and so you are licensing technology into your organization to manufacture it and distribute it and sell it into that market. Or probably I would say overall less commonly, but I say that with a caveat because how common this is depends upon the type of industry that you're in and the type of product we're talking about, are cross-licensing arrangements. In those arrangements, we usually have two technology owners. Each of them has proprietary technology, and they decide to license their proprietary technologies, to each other in order to achieve a greater value. So what I mean by that is that these two technology owners have determined that their technologies have more value being used together than being used on their own. And so they license them to each other to allow work to occur to kind of bring those two technologies together and create a product in combination that can be used to meet a market need. So another really common type of commercial arrangement in the IP space is actually a commercialization arrangement. And this is something that has a lot of the components of a licensing arrangement, but is broader than that. So a commercialization arrangement will usually focus on the development of a market, as well as getting a product out into that market. So as part of these arrangements, the parties usually identify a current or target market, a growth market perhaps, and they create a promotional or marketing strategy to help reach that market. They establish often a distribution or retail type channel or mechanism, and they contemplate growth over time to kind of keep that revenue stream dynamic, help it grow, help that value that's being extracted increase over time. These arrangements often involve kind of reporting, if you will, to the licensor or the owner of the technology being commercialized to ensure that appropriate and effective commercialization activities are occurring with respect to that technology. Another very common type of commercial arrangement, particularly I think for a lot of the folks that are participating today, and a lot of participants in the agriculture and food industry, are collaborative arrangements. So these arrangements also, much like the ones we've already discussed, can take many different forms, and they cover a greater span of activity in the product development life cycle than perhaps our other two types that we just discussed do. So these arrangements typically contemplate R&D activities as well as activities relating to commercialization of a product. So what these arrangements are contemplating is that there will need to be research into and development of a product in order to have something to get to market. And so they may involve multiple, well, they do always involve multiple parties or collaborators. How many depends upon the arrangement itself. And each of those collaborators are contributing something to that broader product adoption life cycle. Finally, technology transfer is really a commercial arrangement that is focused more on granting exclusive rights to a technology, assigning those rights, or divesting those rights if a technology is underused or could be exploited more effectively by another organization. These are often a source of lump sum revenue. So now we'll just dive a little bit deeper into each of these so that you have some really practical tips. So licensing arrangements. Licensing arrangements or license agreements are really focused on allowing a licensor to grant a licensee or someone else, a third party, permission to do certain things with respect to a technology that the licensor owns. So without the license, they wouldn't have the right to do those things. So the licensor retains the title to the technology that is being licensed and grants the licensee certain rights to do certain things with that IP. So again, this is probably something quite familiar to most, if not all of you. But what I will say about license agreements is that they can be very simple or they can be highly complex. It really depends on the industry, the parties, the technology, all of those things. But regardless of how simple or complex they are, whether they are a simple 5-page agreement or a really complex 80-page agreement, there are several key issues that a license agreement should always address to ensure that the scope of the licensing arrangement is clear and that everyone knows what they are allowed to do, not allowed to do, and what they're getting in exchange for that. So the sort of first key component that I'll talk about is that sort of the permissions that are being granted in the license agreement. This is the actual license grant. And it's defining its scope well is really key for a license agreement, or else it's really not clear what the licensee is allowed to do, and there may be a difference of opinion between the licensee and licensor regarding what that should be. So in the grant of license, what you're talking about here are things like defining what is commonly referred to as the field of use. So what I mean by that is defining the purpose for which a license is being granted by a licensor to a licensee, and how that license can be exercised. And I guess another way of putting it is, in what applications can that technology be used? So for example, a licensee may be granted a license to manufacture a technology or to use IP in the manufacture of a product. It may be granted a license to market and sell a technology. It may be granted a license to evaluate and trial a technology. Or to give you an example of that that's really crisp in the ag and food space, a licensee may be granted a license to conduct breeding activities with a technology or development activities to further develop a technology before it's ready for market. Once you've kind of fleshed out that grant of rights and what that field of use should be, it's important to think about, okay, I'm the licensor, I'm granting the licensee these rights in my technology. What do I get in exchange for that grant? So what is the compensation for the grant of rights? It's critical to think through this and define it well to ensure that the licensor feels that it's being compensated adequately for the use of its technology. So what that compensation is and can be is quite variable. It's most often a monetary payment of some kind. It can be in the form of a one-time or periodic license fee, or it can be in the form of an ongoing royalty, but it can also in some cases be non-monetary. So what I mean by that is your compensation could be a cross-license. So it could be you're giving somebody a license and your compensation is they're giving a license to you in their technology. In more, rare is maybe too strong of a word, but in the less common case, there may be a non-monetary compensation in the form of access to certain resources for that licensor to help develop more technology going forward. Compensation being a really key part. I don't want to kind of skim over that too quickly, but we will get a little bit more into that later. But another area that a license agreement should really focus on are what are the boundaries of the license grant that is given in the license. So what I mean by this is, does the license contemplate where and how the license can be exercised, or how that grant of rights can be exercised and where? So is there a territory in which it can be exercised? For example, can the licensee exercise their license only in Canada, in North America, worldwide? What is that territorial limitation or scope? Is that license exclusive, non-exclusive, or sole? So am I making that licensee the only entity that is able to exercise this technology? Am I allowing them to be one of several or many who are exercising this technology? Or am I allowing them to be the only one other than me, the licensor, who is allowed to exercise that technology? Defining that is very important too, again, to avoid misunderstandings and make sure that you haven't inadvertently limited what you're able to do with your technology as a licensor. For example, if you don't really know much yet about what your potential applications for a technology could be, or what your potential market is, you may want to tread a little bit more carefully with granting an exclusive license to one licensee. If you do that, it then prevents you from being able to explore other opportunities with other licensees in other markets, for other product applications, etc. And finally, in this vein, I think it's also important to consider if the grant is influenced by any licensee obligation. For example, what you will sometimes see in a license is that in order for the grant to remain valid, or in order for the grant to remain exclusive, the licensee has to achieve certain milestones, certain sales thresholds, complete certain activities, etc. So thinking about that is important here as well. And that's sometimes a really valuable thing to include if you're not entirely confident that the licensee that you have chosen is going to be able to really extract value from this technology for you, or if you're just uncertain about the marketplace. So another thing to consider as kind of a key point in a license agreement is how you actually kind of verify that the license that you've granted is being complied with. Because remember, we've talked a bit about what some of the restrictions and parameters around license grants can be. So how do you actually make sure that somebody is living within those boundaries, or a licensee is living within those boundaries? A good license will have kind of verification tools, if you will, for that. So it may include an ability to review certain records of the licensee, to request information from the licensee regarding, for example, sales of products containing your technology, or it may even include the ability to have an auditor review certain operations of the licensee. So it's important consideration. It's also crucial to specify how long a license lasts. I can tell you from experience, I have seen many a license agreement come across my desk in my day that doesn't include a license term. And it then becomes a bit confusing for the parties to understand, how long does this grant last? And does it have an endpoint? Sometimes I think it is assumed that if, for example, you are licensing a patented technology, that the grant of license may just extend for the life of that patent. But that's not really an assumption that should generally be made. It's always a good idea to actually specify in your license agreement what the term of that agreement is, or more specifically, what the term of that license grant is. Oops, jumping ahead again. Okay. A few more considerations for license agreements that I want you to be aware of if you're not already. One of the most critical areas to address well in a license agreement is that division of risk with respect to use of the technology that's being licensed. So, for example, a licensee will often want some assurance that it can in fact use the technology it is being licensed in the way that it has been assured that it can. So it may want the licensor to provide some sort of warranty, for example, regarding the licensor's ownership of that technology, the licensor's ability to make a grant of rights in that technology. A licensee may also want comfort that what it is paying to license is not going to, or does not, I should say, infringe third-party IP rights. And finally, that licensee may want an assurance or a warranty regarding some sort of quality or characteristic of that technology. So for example, you do see that sort of warranty pop up not infrequently in things like seed license agreements, where you may have a really novel technology incorporated into certain varieties of seed. There you may want a warranty, for example, that if you are, for example, licensing a variety of herbicide tolerant seed, that the seed is actually herbicide tolerant. So that's what I mean by kind of a quality or characteristic related warranty. A licensor, on the other hand, is going to want to manage its risk by receiving assurances from the licensee that the licensee has the ability to enter into the agreement, that it will assume the responsibilities that are outlined in that agreement, and that it won't use the technology that is being licensed to it other than as granted. So it will comply with any limitations regarding that use. So it's important to sort of think through, as a licensee or a licensor, what are the risks presented to you by this arrangement, and how should those risks be allocated between the two parties? How should they be shifted? How should they be moved? Who should bear what risk? This is often spoken to through a combination of the representations and warranties in your license agreement, the indemnification clauses, and the liability clauses. And I mentioned the latter couple of types of clauses because it's important for a license agreement to also consider what happens in the event that some of those assurances I talked about turn out to be untrue or invalid. So in some cases, this may mean that the agreement can actually be terminated. But in other cases, it means that the party who gave the warranty or the assurance will actually indemnify the party who received it from any losses that party may incur as a result of that assurance or that warranty being untrue. So this can become a very protracted discussion on these points. And I will tell you, practically speaking, as someone who advises on these types of agreements frequently, this risk allocation piece is very, very often where the bulk of the negotiation occurs on a license agreement. People want what they want, but they want to use it with as little risk to them as possible. So they will try to negotiate ways in the license agreement to actually minimize their risk or offload it to the other party. It's also important to make sure with license agreements that you're thinking about confidential information. So not just the tech that you're actually being licensed and however that's defined, but other information that you might need to make use of that technology. So it may be the case that there is some know-how or some other confidential information the licensor has to share with the licensee in order to help them use the technology. And there may be information given by the licensee to the licensor regarding its usage of that technology, what it's achieved using it, etc. That type of information is often going to be confidential between the parties, and so having appropriate confidentiality terms is important in the license agreement. With license agreements, you're often considering, not always, but often considering as well, what happens if in the course of the license or the term of the license, there is an improvement developed to the technology. Should the improvement then automatically become part of the license grant? How should that be used? And depending on who developed that improvement, who should own it? Sometimes licensees, through their use of a licensed technology, actually come up with an improvement to it. And if they do that, who should own that? That's a really context-driven question, but one that should be asked. And finally, with license agreements, like any type of legal agreement, we go into them with the best of intentions, assuming that the relationship that is established there is going to be positive, that everybody's going to do what they should do, that it's all going to work out well. And that is the right view to go into these agreements with. But the reality is that sometimes that doesn't happen and things don't go as planned. So it's important to make sure that you've turned your mind in these agreements to how are you going to actually address disputes that may arise. So, and again, how you do that will really depend upon what makes sense for the parties and for the relationship. So let's move into commercialization arrangements. So these can take many forms. As I mentioned sort of in one of our earlier slides, commercialization arrangements are kind of a broader type of arrangement that often is focused on taking a technology that has been developed or a technology that is the first in a series of related technologies that are being developed and framing a path to market for that technology. So these agreements involve licensing, but take it further than that. So they really delineate that commercialization strategy and the roles of the parties to the agreement in that strategy. So what these agreements sometimes do, not always, but sometimes, is establish what I refer to as kind of a pipeline scenario, where in order to infiltrate a market, a first piece of technology is introduced to that market. And then if that market is infiltrated successfully, additional related pieces of technology may follow and also be introduced to that market. So an example of that would be if a party is working on developing varieties of a specialty crop new to the Canadian market. That party might enter into a commercial agreement or a commercialization agreement, pardon me, with another party, whereby that other party will develop a commercialization strategy to get a promising variety of that specialty crop into the Canadian market and build demand for it. If that is done successfully, the commercializing party would then receive licenses to additional varieties of that specialty crop type to commercialize as well, therefore building out the market for that crop type over time. So that's an example of a pipeline scenario. Commercialization agreements often contain a broader grant of rights than what you would see in a license agreement. So rather than maybe just a right to market and sell, you may have a grant that includes the right to conduct further development work on that technology, to produce or manufacture products containing that technology, or maybe a right to distribute, retail, export that technology to reach end customers. So because of the breadth of the activities that are usually covered in these arrangements, it's important to consider who has the rights and the results of these activities. For example, if the other party in a commercialization arrangement sort of is using your technology and improves it or develops an add-on for it or a modification to it or develops something that relies on it, who should own that? This is a complicated question that often comes up in commercialization arrangements where there is any further development work going on. So that isn't happening in all commercialization arrangements, but it's pretty common. So addressing the ownership of what may result from commercialization activities is really a key point. Let's dive into some of the considerations that I want to make sure you focus on next time you look at one of these arrangements. Okay, so with commercialization arrangements, in many ways, a lot of the content of these is going to be very similar to what you would see in a license agreement. And so a lot of the considerations we just talked about with respect to license agreements are going to be considerations that are important for you to keep in mind with a commercialization arrangement as well. However, there are some additional considerations that bear some mention here and that I want to raise with you when you're thinking about a commercialization arrangement in particular. So, For example, as I've already alluded to a couple of times, but I'm going to just sort of drill this into you because it's so important, a commercialization plan or strategy should be included in a commercialization agreement. You don't have to have all elements of that fleshed out at the outset of the agreement, and sometimes the agreement is actually focusing on how the parties are going to work together to develop that strategy. But the fact that that is going to occur and how it's going to occur should at least be fleshed out. The parties should also contemplate what happens when the arrangement comes to an end. And this is something that, again, as a practical example for you, I see overlooked very often, but it shouldn't be, because this is often where disputes arise in the course of these agreements. So the parties need to contemplate what happens after the agreement expires or terminates, and more specifically, what happens to what was developed in the course of that arrangement. So you may, as I mentioned earlier, have further development work that occurs in the course of the relationship with respect to technology. So what happens to what was developed? Who's allowed to use it going forward after that agreement comes to an end? These agreements also involve developing that strategy regarding commercialization and regarding marketing and market dissemination. What happens with that after the agreement? Who can kind of take that forward and run with that? How do you manage the fact that now potentially the two parties in this arrangement might be competing with each other? This is a situation that needs to be considered, and how you address that will depend upon, again, the context of the agreement and what's actually happening. The agreement should also outline how costs associated with different commercialization related activities will be sort of shared or borne between the parties. You have to make sure that it's clear where the burden for certain activities is placed and who's going to bear the cost of those. If you're going to share those costs, if one party is going to take on this cost and another party is going to take on that cost, these are things that should be fleshed out. And they should relate to the contributions of the parties. So for example, if one party is providing a lot of kind of in-kind resource to the commercialization arrangement, the other party may be the appropriate party to provide some financial resource. A critical piece of commercialization arrangements is discussing how the revenue generated from that commercialization activity is going to be shared. How will it be shared? In what proportions? How is compensation to a party involved in this arrangement calculated? This may mean, for example, that one party sells a technology and generates revenue from it, and then pays the other party a portion of that revenue. Or it may be a price per unit sold that is paid by one party to the other party, or some other model. But making sure revenue might be generated, and based on that, how it can be shared between the parties is a critical component of these arrangements. One other thing I want to mention with commercialization arrangements, because they are broader, as I mentioned earlier, is that they often are describing a more complicated relationship or a more involved relationship than what you would see in, for example, a straight license agreement. For that reason, over the course of that relationship, it may be the case that supplementary expertise or skill is needed from others. So it's important to think about, in your commercialization arrangement, will there be a kind of permission to have third parties involved? Can subcontractors be brought in? Will you need to sub-license your rights as a licensee under that commercialization arrangement to another party so that they can help perform certain activities that you would otherwise take on? Talking about that is important to make sure there are no misunderstandings. Okay, collaboration agreements. Again, like commercialization arrangements, these will often, or in almost all cases, have many of the same considerations as a license agreement. So they'll have some of that same content. And again, those considerations we talked about earlier with respect to license agreements are going to have relevance to collaborative arrangements as well. But also like a commercialization arrangement, Collaboration arrangements are broader in scope. Commercialization arrangements are often focused on executing a path to market for a technology that has already been developed. Collaboration agreements, by contrast, although they are also broad, are focused on something slightly different. They're usually focused on the development of a technology that will eventually be commercialized. So they're often entered into where parties have complementary technologies or complementary skills and resources. For example, one party might have funds, but not R&D capability. One party may have researchers, but not adequate facilities and equipment to conduct the research using those researchers. One party may have technology that meets an end customer need, but not another need that they would like to meet. And so they would like access to additional technology to help meet that additional need. Now, because of the variation that exists here, collaborative arrangements take many forms and go by many different titles. So I've given you a few examples of some titles that you may have seen. Collaborative Research and Development Agreements, or CRADAs, are an example of this. Joint development agreements are an example of this. Research funding agreements or funded research agreements are examples of this. There are, much like our past two agreement types, many important considerations to bear in mind when you're crafting a collaboration arrangement or entering into one. These considerations on the whole largely focus on defining the contributions of each party or each collaborator to the collaboration, being clear over the control of those contributions and how they can be used both during the collaboration and afterward, and how things that result from the collaboration or from the marriage of these contributions will be handled. So let's talk about that in a bit more detail. So building on that, some key considerations for collaboration arrangement are kind of listed for you here. And let's just go through those to help explain what they are. So when you're thinking about contributions to the collaboration, which, as I mentioned, is a really key part of what you should be thinking about when you're crafting a collaboration arrangement, you're thinking about, for example, who needs to provide funding to enable these activities to occur. Is there existing or background technology that needs to be brought into the collaboration to facilitate the collaboration? And if so, who is providing that, or who is responsible to provide it? What facilities and resources are needed to facilitate that collaboration? These are very, very context-dependent things. And what might be needed for a collaboration is going to vary from collaboration to collaboration. Who is best suited to provide it is going to vary. And you really have to think through that. So think about what each person is bringing to the table and how you're going to value that. If the collaboration is successful, and of course we're always going to hope that it is, that's really the purpose for entering into the arrangement in the first place, it will produce results, and hopefully really useful or valuable results. So with that in mind, it's important to consider who is going to own those results or have a right to use them. Those results are often referred to as arising IP or foreground IP. So will ownership of that be granted to one party? Will it be granted to both parties so that it's a joint ownership scenario? Or will ownership be granted to one party and that party grants a license to another party or other parties? So this is something that needs to be thought through carefully. What is appropriate will really depend upon the circumstances of the collaboration, the nature of the funding for the collaboration, the policies of the parties involved in the collaboration, and the goals of it. So again, that's the context to be considered. So it's also important to think about that post-collaboration period. Even if the collaboration is successful, it will eventually come to an end. Much like we discussed in the context of commercialization arrangements, it's important to think about what happens after the collaboration. How do you unwind it? And so diving into that a little bit deeper, what's meant by that consideration is really thinking through how you're going to manage the technology that was brought into the collaboration and results from the collaboration after it ends. Who can use it? Can it be further developed or placed in new applications? This is a particular concern in agreements that relate to collaboration with respect to things such as breeding activities or software development activities. If the collaboration, for example, results in new or improved germplasm or new or improved code, who can use that? And how can they use it after the parties who developed it in their collaboration are no longer working together? This is addressed to some degree by really defining who owns foreground or arising IP, but it's often more complicated than that, especially if that ownership is joint or it relies on the usage of background IP of one of the parties to the collaboration. So because it's complicated and often hard to delineate at the outset of a collaboration, you sometimes see what I call agreements to agree. So we will agree on who's going to own this once it is developed and we can consider who the appropriate owner is. At a high level, that makes sense, but I would caution you to be careful with those agreements to agree. Too often, the later agreement that has to be arrived at proves really difficult to arrive at or doesn't happen at all. And that leaves a lot of uncertainty for the parties who were involved in the collaboration regarding how IP that came from that collaboration can be used, and presents a risk that the use that does occur is not permissible or is not unrestrained. So finally, with collaboration, or pardon me, as we talked about with commercialization arrangements, think about how third parties might need to be involved in the collaboration activity. So again, like commercialization arrangements, we're talking about a broader, probably more longer term arrangement. Over time, there may be a need to bring third parties into that. So think about if that can happen and how that can happen and what may be permissible. So remember, with a collaboration agreement, your focus is really on working together to achieve benefit for all of the parties. So with a collaboration agreement, you have to approach it with the spirit of collaboration. How do you work together to make something better? And how you handle all of these questions or these considerations should be driven by that. That should be the lens you're looking at that through. So let's talk about technology transfer for a few minutes. A lot of you might be thinking, aren't all of those types of agreements potentially examples of technology transfer in certain contexts? And the answer is yes, but when we're talking about technology transfer agreements kind of as their own thing, what we're really talking about is a situation where a party doesn't really have an interest in retaining ownership or control over their technology and believes that it may be better utilized by someone else. So they're very common where, for example, an inventor of a technology is not interested in being responsible for commercializing it or bringing it to market, or for even strategizing with respect to this. So in these cases, the inventor may have significant expertise regarding, for example, research, but less expertise or capacity regarding whatever comes after that research. So common places where you see technology transfer arrangements used are things like academic institutions, smaller scale research institutions, individual inventors, things of that nature. Organizations or people who are very focused on developing technology, researching it and coming up with a new technology, but aren't really focused on the commercialization aspect of that, or doing the steps that are required to extract value from that after it's been developed. So in technology transfer arrangements, what most commonly occurs is that the IP in question is transferred to someone else, or control over it is relinquished to someone else. So this can occur in a variety of ways, or a variety of agreement types. So this can occur via, for example, the transfer and assignment of a piece of technology or IP to another individual, or to a spin-off entity. So you've probably all heard the phrase spin-off before, and really what we mean by that is let's say you have entity A who has developed a proprietary technology or a piece of IP. They don't want to hold that IP for some of the reasons perhaps that I just described. And so they spin that IP off, or they transfer and assign it to another entity who is prepared to sort of take that IP and sort of run with it going forward. Technology transfer can also occur through the sale of IP in the context of, for example, an asset purchase arrangement where entity B might be buying a bunch of assets of entity A. And through that, it is acquiring assets that include things like your intangibles, like IP. So it may be purchasing that IP outright. Sometimes also technology transfer can occur through just a full-scale exhaustive license grant, where all the licensor's rights are effectively licensed to a third party. So the third party controls the IP in the same way that the licensor can, typically, but the licensor retains ownership of that IP. It may want to do that because it wants to place a time limit on the transfer and not just have it be kind of into infinity, or it may want to kind of retain a record of inventorship, but it doesn't want to do anything with the IP. So there's lots of different ways in which tech transfer can occur. But the key is, ensuring that you've really thought through what you want to occur and that you've defined it appropriately. So let's talk about some of the key considerations for these types of arrangements. So probably most obvious, really think about what you want to transfer. What are you actually assigning or selling or transferring to another party? How do you want to do that? Do you want to do it in a full-scale transfer, a limited transfer, etc.? What is the mechanism that achieves best what you want to achieve? Are there limitations on what's included in that transfer or how it can be used? So sometimes what you might see is, for example, transfer of only a piece of a broader technology. And by transferring that piece, you're kind of limiting what the transferee can do with the technology. So that's sometimes a consideration here in these types of arrangements. Think also about what you're receiving in exchange for that transfer. Again, that compensation element is critical. Are you receiving a one-time lump sum or fee? Is somebody just paying you outright for the technology? They pay you X, they now have that technology and run with it going forward and keep all of the revenue that they generate from using it. Or is there an ongoing payment happening here? Are they paying you a lump sum now, but they're still gonna pay to you over time a portion of the return that they receive on using that technology? Again, what is appropriate here will depend a bit on what type of technology transfer arrangement you choose and what your objectives and goals are. But before entering into a technology transfer arrangement at all, you should really ask yourself the question, do I actually want to transfer my IP in its entirety, or do I want to retain some sort of right in it? If the answer is the latter, that you want to retain some sort of right in it, consider whether a technology transfer arrangement is really the right sort of arrangement for you, or if instead a license agreement might be better, even if it's a really broad scale license agreement, or a technology transfer with a grant back. What I mean by that is it may be the case that you actually do want to transfer or sell that IP kind of as a whole to someone else so that they have to manage it going forward. They take care of it, they figure out the strategy for it, but you may still want to retain a very limited ability to use that IP. So what you might do as part of that transfer is also include a grant back of a limited license to you in that transfer. So for example, you transfer that technology to party A, and party A grants you a license back in that technology, but only to, for example, maybe do some further research. That might require you to include that technology in the research. So things to consider here. Tech transfer can work really well, and sometimes it makes perfect sense, but sometimes it's not the right arrangement, and it's important to think about that before diving into it. Okay, so that is again, a fairly high level view of what I would call the most common commercial arrangements used to extract value from technology. And as you sort of would have seen through that discussion, there are a lot of things to consider. Which type of arrangement makes sense for you will depend on what your strategy is, and what your strategy is will depend upon where you are in that product adoption life cycle and where you want to move. So it all fits together, and your thinking on this should be relatively in depth to make sure that you're doing what ultimately makes sense both for you now and for later. But extracting value in IP doesn't just happen through commercial arrangements. It also happens through ensuring that you are retaining value in your IP. How do you retain value in your IP? Well, one of the most effective ways of retaining value in your IP is through understanding and implementing a proper enforcement approach to IP. So we here need to think about not necessarily how we're going to get IP out to market and start bringing in revenue, but how we're going to make sure that we continue to have the ability to do that. When we're talking about enforcement, we're talking about really ensuring that we are doing things that keep our IP valuable, that keep it exclusive, that keep it desirable for somebody else to use and to interact with us to arrive at a commercial arrangement that allows a person to use that IP. If you are not enforcing your rights in IP and not paying attention to that, and as a result, people can use your IP kind of as they see fit, without worry of consequence or without approaching you regarding ensuring they have a proper grant of rights, then it's not very desirable for another party to actually enter into a commercial arrangement with you and pay you for the use of that IP. So enforcement is really, really critical. Now, how do you approach enforcement? Well, there's a number of sorts of activities that are involved in enforcement. There is proactive detection, monitoring competitor activity, using appropriate legal remedies such as cease and desist letters, seeking injunctions, bringing an infringement suit or other type of litigation. What is appropriate really depends upon the nature of the conduct that you see occurring and what you are enforcing your rights with respect to. I just want to stress here, if you're allowing a party to use your proprietary technology without authorization, there is no value to anyone in seeking authorization from you to use it. So enforcement is really key here. So let's talk about some ways that you can look at enforcement. The first thing I like to talk about here is preventative tips. So people often think about enforcement as, suing people for using their technology when they weren't allowed to do so. And that's part of enforcement. But there are a lot of preventative things that a party can do as well. So let's just talk about those for a minute, because you can often avoid some of that more rigorous reactive enforcement activity by doing some preventative or proactive things up front. So first of all, really know what IP you have. This may sound like a silly thing to mention, but I mention it because sometimes, especially if you are an organization that has a lot of IP, it can almost become difficult to keep track of all of it, how it fits together, what the scope of it is, and you may have that understanding of what IP you have only at a certain level of your organization. It's important to ensure that employees in general within your organization, so your personnel overall, understand what IP the organization has and what needs to be protected. Then they can better understand how to protect it, make better choices regarding how they handle it, etc. So it's really important to have that communication and to have that understanding kind of more broadly within your organization. Next, really know where your IP is. this one, again, might seem a bit silly, but this is something I see a lot. A lot of parties know they have IP, but they haven't really kept track of where it is and how it's being used, who it has been disseminated to, who might be able to use it. And so it becomes very hard for them to really think about, is something happening here that shouldn't be happening? They can't put their arms around that because they don't really have their arms around what they allowed in the first place. So really focus on trying to make sure you know where your IP is within your organization. So if it's something a little bit more tangible, like a articulated process, a report, a piece of software, where do you keep it? Where do you allow it to be used or moved? Understanding that is important. Labeling your IP in a lot of instances is a good idea. And this is really key, particularly in things that are copyrighted. So making sure that you've got valuable IP marked as being proprietary is a really good way of sort of providing that notice to people who may come across that IP that it can't be used without authorization. So for things like software, for example, there may be, if you had a physical piece of software you could download, which is less common these days. You may have a label or a banner on the packaging that basically brings to the observer's attention that this is a copyrighted product and can't be used without authorization. For reports, you may see something similar to this. For things that are downloadable via a website, you may see a very clear sort of banner or notice of proprietary rights on that site at the point of download. So this labeling is a really key component of being preventative in enforcement activities. Securing your IP, both physically and digitally, depending on the context, is really important as well, and something to focus on. So lock the rooms where sensitive data is stored. Lock laboratories where research is happening and where proprietary processes or information or material may be being developed. If what is generated from your activities is stored, for example, electronically, put it on a secure server. Use passwords, user credentials, possibly even encryption where appropriate, and limit access to employees or personnel who have a need to know. Tying back into that knowing what IP you have concept that I mentioned earlier, educate your employees and personnel about intellectual property, not just about what you have, which is what we were talking about kind of in that first point, but also just about IP in general. Increasing awareness regarding how IP needs to be handled, what steps should be taken to protect it, kind of across your organization can make a world of difference in preventing misuse, preventing unintentional dissemination, preventing unauthorized use or inappropriate permissions regarding use. So this can happen through awareness training, it can happen through company policy, it can happen through just general ongoing communication, but that education is really critical. And I note that because I just want you to be aware that in most cases, IP leaves an organization by accident or through negligence. So make sure that your personnel are aware of how they could unintentionally expose IP. That unintentional exposure most often happens through things like external email accounts, through file sharing, through collaboration tools like Dropbox, things like that, through instant messaging, especially through platforms like WhatsApp, sending email to the wrong person, using a wrong email address, attaching the wrong file. All of these things are accidents that can be a substantial source of leaks for your IP. So encouraging carefulness and consistent process with respect to what personnel within your organization do can really help minimize the risk of these things happening. Know your tools to protect your intellectual property. So there are a growing number of tools that are available for tracking documents and for tracking stores of IP. So these are called data loss prevention tools, and they can allow you to locate sensitive documents, track how they're being used or accessed and by whom, and they can be very useful. They aren't necessary in all cases, but you may have other tools that are at your disposal. And finally, this might seem like a strange point to include, adopt a counterintelligence mindset. And I don't mean that you need to be all sort of pretending that you are spies and looking at the world through that lens, but there is some benefit in trying to think about, if you were trying to find out what your company was doing, what would you do? If you were outside of your organization and wanting to kind of peer into what your organization is doing because you might want to copy that or take that, what would you do? Think about things through that lens. And that can help you decide what some activities you should employ within your organization are to prevent inadvertent or unauthorized access to your IP. Think through things like even the most basic things, shredding paperwork, implementing appropriate IT system security protocols, having an internal committee within your organization to review and approve publications before they are made, so that you're not inadvertently including information that you shouldn't include. Lots of ideas here, but that's the lens to kind of look at this through. And then if your prevention activities are not successful or fail in some regard, prepare to deal with that more traditional reactive protection or enforcement of your IP rights. So there you're actually looking for legal remedies. What do you do to stop that unauthorized use of your IP from occurring? Could be an injunction, it could be through seeking some sort of compensatory damages for losses that you've incurred, etc. And then I just want to leave you today with key points to take away. We've covered a lot. There's a lot more that could be covered, but as we sort of wrap this up for today, I just want you to take away a few key points to remember. You know, really think about that strategy and think critically about your technology, your research, and your goals. What do you want to achieve? And with that, what can you do on your own versus what do you need help with? Encourage collaboration, as it's in most cases a positive thing that will help you extract more value, but protect your assets even when collaboration is occurring. Share, but share in a controlled and structured and monitored way, so that you always keep that control of your IP and always know where it is. Understand your market and opportunities. So really do your due diligence to figure out what's already happening in the marketplace. How can you be different? How can you execute a strategy that helps you differentiate yourself from your competitors and help you infiltrate the market in the most effective way possible? And finally, always look for new opportunities to expand your reach. Even if your strategy is X today, your strategy may evolve to be something else tomorrow, and be open to that, be dynamic. So with that, I will turn it over to Megan, who I think has a few points that she would like to go through with you as well. So I'm going to stop sharing. And I really thank you for your attention. So over to you, Megan.
Thank you very much, Crystal. You've certainly earned a break for your voice. You must be exhausted. That was great information.
I'm used to it, but thank you.
Really appreciate it. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. And can I just get a, Crystal, are you seeing what you should there? Perfect. Okay. All right. I will jump into my slides now. And really, I just want to, before we open up for questions, just spend a few minutes sort of drawing the connection between all the great things we learned from Crystal today and the work that's being done via our Protein Industries Canada's members projects. Diffusion of technology is a priority for our membership, and the IP processes and resources that we've designed within PIC really are there to assist with that. So, jumping in just to a very quick introduction of PIC, the global demand for protein is growing, and together with our partners, Protein Industries Canada will invest $300 million to transform Canada's value-added processing sector. The work that we do within PIC projects is collaborative in nature, and we often talk about doing business differently to leverage diverse strengths. So I think a lot of what Crystal talked today around collaborative agreements really applies to the members who we work with on developing technology projects. And as you can imagine, there's a need to really consider intellectual property early and often within our projects at PIC. So the areas of project investment that PIC makes sort of fall into two camps. We have our capacity building program and then a technology leadership program. And my comments today are going to focus specifically on the technology leadership program. But please explore our website or reach out via email for more information around the capacity building program as you need it. The approach to technology leadership projects that PIC has undertaken is based on a value chain approach to co-investment. So we support different projects that fall within 4 different sort of technology pillars. And while the same principles of IP management apply across our projects, the IP and commercialization strategies that are, for instance, applied to a project that focuses on creation of high quality germplasm from Canadian crops, so that would fall under our create pillar, are quite different than the approach to collaborative development that we would see in, for instance, a co-product utilization project under our make pillar. So, same principles, but we really need to be strategic in how IP is applied to different types of projects. When it comes to IP management at PIC, we do look at projects from really a principles-based approach. So we work with companies to get an understanding through the collaborative project, how the intellectual property, whether it's registered or trade secret, plays into the commercial priorities for each project consortium member, and particularly how the consortia's approach to IP management will ensure that there's a return on the research investments that we're making together. So I'm going to go briefly through sort of 3 types of resources that are developed within our PIC technology projects and how each will contribute to the extraction of value from our members' projects. So I think the first one, and that people who have been to our prior webinars are used to hearing me talk about, is our IP rationale. IP rationales are a component of each technology proposal that we receive, and sort of look at 3 different areas. So we consider background intellectual property, foreground intellectual property, and then an overview of the commercialization and diffusion strategy within our rationales. IP rationales belong to the project consortia members, and our job here at PIC is to help support the development of it. So Crystal had mentioned our earlier webinar, and that was really focused on sort of the fundamentals of intellectual property. And that's all really important when it comes to drafting your IP rationale, sort of understanding what sort of protection would make sense in a given case. If you weren't able to attend that webinar or one of our previous in-person sessions that we were able to have, let us know and we'd be happy to provide you with the link to view the 1.0 webinar that we recently did. But really, those principles are helpful to inform how background and foreground IP are managed in a project. And then the commercialization approaches that Crystal walked through today are really key when thinking about what happens to the IP coming out of the projects and what does that look like in the longer term. So ecosystem diffusion is considered as part of our IP rationales, but it's sort of the second piece. And this is really where we're looking at the forward-looking exercise that looks at what the consortia is going to do with their IP following the project and what the potential commercial impact of technologies being developed will be on their businesses. So through the ecosystem diffusion exercise that we go through in proposal development, we really challenge our consortia members to kind of, I'd say, dig deep into development of a list of prospective candidate licensees or customers for their technologies. So we need to understand when we're looking at an investment in a project, who the customer is and that there's a market that exists for what it is that you're developing. And it is a very forward-looking exercise. If we're talking about the diffusion of a technology that hasn't been developed yet, a lot can change over the course of a 2.5 or 3-year project. So it's something that we look at the beginning, but also something that we consider throughout execution of a project. And we're always kind of coming back to the question of how we're going to ensure that there's a return on investment into that research. And so the new piece today is really our intellectual property registry, and we're in the final stages of developing our IP registry, which will serve as an online marketplace to connect developers of technology with potential customers and collaborators. So as part of the contribution agreement between Protein Industries Canada and ISED, there is a requirement for IP generated with supercluster funding to be listed in a searchable format for members to initiate licensing discussions. The approach that we've taken to this at PIC, I think, is quite exciting in that we've elected to sort of broaden the scope of the IP registry to also have more of a commercial focus in describing the IP in addition to just containing the required filing information. So our registry is going to have two parts, the first being a sort of non-commercially sensitive but really commercially focused abstract, which will allow the project consortium members to identify the knowledge, technologies, products, and services that are being created as part of their project foreground IP. And the abstracts will be something that we'll work on collaboratively with the project teams to ensure that we're really reflecting the reality of what's being developed as well as the evolution of the project as it's being executed. And something I think that's exciting to note as well is that while we do require that any technology project participants report into the IP registry, we're also going to open it up more broadly to the PIC membership and enable our members to include either background IP or non-project related intellectual property in the registry so that you can take advantage of that marketplace opportunity as well. The second part of the IP registry is the filings, and this is where information on registered IP generated through PIC projects will be housed. The filings section of the registry will inform PIC members of filings that are associated with our projects, and will provide licensing contact information as applicable. So the first question when I discuss this is always, what about trade secrets? And those will not be captured in the filings part of the registry, obviously. It would be difficult to include a trade secret there. However, certainly the presence of different types of knowledge or know-how might be captured in part of your abstract. And so that's something we'll work through on a case-by-case basis with our members as we're populating the registry. So as I mentioned, we're getting close to being at the point where we can launch the registry, and so I'm working with active projects on preparing their abstracts, and then we'll continue to roll that out as information is available. So with that, I know we're getting close to time here, and I'm sure that we have some questions that folks are anxious to put forward, particularly to Crystal. So I'll close out the formal part of the presentation and just mention that if you want to discuss aspects of PIC's approach to IP, my contact information is available here and will be provided, and certainly reach out and we can do that. So I will stop sharing there and join Crystal and Carson for some questions.
Awesome. Thanks, Megan. That was great. And thanks, Crystal, for all the information. I think it's been a really informative presentation today from both of you. Just to start off with our questions, I'd just like to let everybody know that the presentations from today will be made available to all the participants later on today following the webinar. The first one, Crystal, that had come in from Aaron was when you're negotiating a service agreement, can or should the different IP agreements be included in that overall agreement, or should they be kept separate and done on their own?
So I'm going to give you a little bit of the most hated legal answer. It depends. But I mean, really, it is entirely possible to include an IP-related arrangement within a broader arrangement. So I think, as I mentioned in my slides, it isn't always the case that, for example, you see a licensing arrangement as a standalone license agreement. Sometimes that is built into a broader commercial arrangement that isn't just focused on the licensing piece, but focused on achieving a broader commercial objective. So you may have a service arrangement that in order for a party to provide service to you, they have to have a license to use your IP in the provision of those services. So you can certainly build it into there, but regardless of whether it stands on its own or is built into another agreement, the point that I want to stress is just to be careful that you're still addressing the key components of a licensing agreement. The danger that I sometimes see people run into is by rolling in, let's say, licensing into a broader agreement, they don't focus on some of the same things they would if the license agreement was standalone, and are silent on some points that they really shouldn't be silent on. So yeah, so I hope that answers the question.
Absolutely. No, that makes sense. And I think that makes sense with anything you do is, you know, you probably will spend a little bit more time and give it a little bit more detail when you focus on just the one agreement compared to compiling it with a lot of other information. So thank you. The next question we had came in, and it's in reference to when you were talking about IP leaving by accident. And they gave an example, and they stipulated that they were asking for a friend. And they said if an email contains technical details and it's accidentally misdirected, is that technology still patentable?
It could be. It kind of depends on the extent of disclosure. Here I go again with the it depends. I'm really living up to my stereotype as a lawyer, but I think what I can say generally is that the more disclosure that you make about a proprietary technology, the more likely it is that that technology has, as they say, entered the public domain, such that it will become difficult, if not impossible, to patent at a later point. Now, whether or not it becomes difficult or impossible to patent does depend upon the extent to which that proprietary technology has been disclosed. So how much information was inadvertently sent? To whom was it sent? Did you send it out to a reply all to 50 people? Did you inadvertently send it to one person? Are you able to retrieve that message? The point being that anytime you publicly disclose proprietary information or technology, you are likely to have an impact on what you can do to protect that technology later. So you have to be very careful with that and really thoughtful about who you're sharing information with, how much of it you're sharing and why, and wherever possible, tracking that sharing so that you can kind of track back what you've done. So short answer is you may not be out of luck, but if the disclosure is extensive, you could be.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. That's interesting. And I like the tracking idea because obviously there are times where you may need to give a little detail to, you know, create some interest and hopefully engage in a collaboration. Yep. So it's important to be able to share some detail, but as long as you're tracking that and not giving away too much, that makes sense. So the next question that I had written down was what are the differentiations between a collaborative R&D agreement from a joint R&D agreement, and kind of what are the two different differences in the approaches?
So what I can say about that is that often, I mean, to be blunt, often those sorts of phrases are used somewhat interchangeably. Now, whether they should or shouldn't be is a different question. How I differentiate them is that if I'm talking about a collaborative R&D agreement, I'm thinking about a situation in which there may be two or more parties involved in that collaboration, and they're each bringing something kind of different to the table that needs to be contributed in order to advance some R&D activities. So somebody might be bringing some funding, somebody might be bringing some technology, some might be bringing some resources, whereas with a joint development agreement or a joint R&D agreement, what I'm more typically thinking of is where the parties involved are bringing similar things to the table and then jointly working on those things together. So for example, you may have parties that are both bringing, I'll pick on the seed subsector of our industry again, both parties might be bringing germplasm to the table and they're working together to use that germplasm in collaboration to produce a more desirable variety. So that is a context that I think of when I think about joint development agreements. But at the end of the day, they're really two different ways of referring to something that is quite similar. So,
great, thank you. That makes a lot of sense. So we had a question come in quickly, and I think we may have touched on it last webinar. So it's a good refresher. But in terms of international collaboration, you know, and because there's a lot of complexities of different laws and things of that nature, what are some of the primary or preliminary steps that we can take when trying to protect our IP and enforce it before entering an agreement with perhaps an international partner?
So if you're looking at collaborating with an international partner, one thing that I would make sure that you think about ahead of time is, do you have protection for the IP that you want to contribute to that collaboration in the jurisdiction in which your collaborator resides and operates? So if you have protection for your technology in, say, Canada, but you want to collaborate with someone in Brazil, and that collaboration would require you to actually share your technology with that collaborator in Brazil, so they may have it there in Brazil with them. You know, it may not be something that you want to do unless you are already in the process of achieving protection for that technology in Brazil, or you include in your collaboration agreement very restrictive provisions and protections regarding the confidentiality of that technology, so that if it is shared with that collaborator in Brazil, they are really restrained in how they can use it until you've had a chance to actually decide if you want to seek protection in Brazil. So that would be kind of the primary thing, I guess. So thinking about location of protection, thinking about confidentiality restrictions flows into that, and thinking about whether or not it's necessary for you to actually take your tech and give a copy of it to that party in Brazil. Or is there some other way you can collaborate without sort of actually giving them sort of a physical access to that? So there are some considerations there for sure, and it needs to be thought through pretty carefully, but it shouldn't result in you kind of taking international collaborations off the table, because there are always ways to deal with these things.
Great. No, that's great insight. I think that's always a big concern, especially as you know, especially in the ag world, as we continue to become very global in nature. So I appreciate that. We're running a little over time, so we'll ask one last question. When it comes from Carla, she was asking, when you're in a collaborative agreement, what have you seen in terms of the process for doing another agreement with the same partner, or a deep dive agreement with respect to IP? And so then she further asks, do you partners bring in a lawyer to walk through the discussion, or do the companies consult their own lawyers and come together and then discuss?
Well, that's a very good question. And I would say probably what I see happen most frequently is that the parties who are seeking to collaborate will think through how they want that collaboration to occur. They might come up with a term sheet. They might even start drafting an agreement, and then they'll each go to their respective lawyers and ask them to review this and comment on it. So that's probably the most common approach. I see that a lot. And it's not an incorrect approach, although I will say, and speaking from somebody who does a lot of this, I personally think it's a lot more effective if you actually at least have a conversation with your lawyer at the term sheet stage to make sure that what you've set out as sort of business terms for this arrangement actually kind of makes some sense legally for the type of collaboration that's being considered. And your lawyer can help point out to you, okay, that's great, that here are some things you're going to need to make sure you address. And you can start building those in before you get to a point where you want to sign the agreement, but your lawyer might then be saying, oh, you can't because you have to deal with this, this, and this. So it can actually be much more efficient to have that proactive conversation than to leave it all to the end. And it may actually contain the negotiations that need to happen a little bit more, make those a little bit less arduous than they might be if you leave that conversation until the end. So the first part of the question, I'm not sure I quite grasped. It sounded as though maybe the question was about if a collaboration agreement can then lead to another agreement that does a deeper dive into IP, and that's absolutely the case. You do see that a lot. Particularly with CRADA type agreements, you'll often see the R&D collaboration really framed out well, with contemplation in the agreement of, if something comes from this collaborative R&D arrangement that we want to commercialize, we will then enter into a supplementary commercialization agreement. And that will define more particularly the rights of the parties, what each person can do with the results of that research, etc. So that does happen. It isn't always all in one document. But again, then you have an agreement to agree concept going on, which, as I mentioned, can be a little bit risky in some cases. So
great. No, thank you. That's great insight. It's interesting to learn a little bit about you know, your firsthand experience of what could be perhaps a more efficient and effective process. So that's great information. I think with that, we're a little over time, and I know both of you have given us lots of time today, so we really appreciate it. I'd like to just say thank you, and any closing remarks from the both of you, please go ahead.
I would just say thank you, everyone, for attending today, for asking great questions, and thank you to PIC for allowing me to work with you on delivering this information to your members and stakeholders. So thank you.
Great. Thanks, Crystal, and thank you, Carson, for doing all the background work for us today and keeping things functioning. And also just to everyone who chose to attend today and was able to stick it out to the end. I know it was a bit of a long webinar, but I think really great content. So thank you and enjoy the rest of your days.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.